War. If there is a single defining truth of the dark and terrible age in which we live, it is war, red and bloody. The ceaseless battle between mankind and the alien, between the divine truth of the God Emperor and the falsehoods of chaos, between brother and brother, between light and dark, life and death. War is all. This treatise concerns but one war among many, but a war whose nature and secrets render it quite exceptional. It was a conflict that rose up to plunge a score of star systems into savage strife. A war which turned entire armies of the Imperium's most powerful warriors against each other, and in doing so swept millions to their deaths in its turbulence. I write, of course, of one of the most insidious and dangerous internecine conflicts to rack our beloved Imperium in many centuries, the Badab War. Such was the treachery of Lugft-Huron, the infamous tyrant of Badab, and such was the carnage wrought among the stars of the Maelstrom Zone, that it rocked the faith and order of untold worlds never touched directly by its violence, and caused loyal subjects to look upon their protectors and fear. Such were the dire sins and hidden truths that lay behind the war, that a pall of secrecy and lies descended about the conflict, even as it was fought, and rightly so. For the Badab War, its true nature, and the questions it raises about the very psyche of the Imperium's greatest weapons of war, the Space Marine chapters of the Adeptus Astartes, are both shocking and fundamentally dangerous. The deeper facts of the war I therefore consider to be a moral threat to all servants and citizens of the Imperium, except at the most high and measured levels. And it is my wholehearted recommendation that the distribution of this treatise be restricted to only the most esteemed among our sacred ordos. Better for humanity the simple tale of heroes and monsters, treachery and courage that is left to the official record, such as it is. Better the lie. The treatise compiled here then endeavors to be as accurate a general précis and briefing of the real events of the Badab War as possible. It is culled from the archives of the Holy Ordos and from such sources as extant documentation, mimetic cerebral recovery, and eyewitness accounts that have so far survived the 20 standard years since the fall of the tyrant. It is also, based in some cases, on evidence that has been purposely hidden from the Edict of Obliteration enacted on the official war record. It will detail also the great schism that led up to the war, and the important worlds, locations, and battles that made up the course of the conflict. Of greatest import in its appendix, it will also detail those Space Marine chapters involved in the Badab War, their unique character, and those warriors within them whose role became prominent in the war, be they hero or monster. This, then, is the true and secret history of the Badab War. Compiled under my seal, Talon Encarmidus, Inquisitor Ordinate, Ordo Hereticus. Esteemed scholars, officers, and seekers of knowledge, we gather today to examine a war whose ramifications still ripple through the Imperium's vast and fragmented structure, a war that, though consigned to distant stars, has left scars deep and wide across our realm. The Badab War, as it came to be known. It is a story of treachery and ambition, fractured loyalties and shattered oaths, where the lines between heroism and heresy blurred beyond recognition. Unlike many others that have scarred our star systems, this war was fought not only with bolter and blade, but also with secret intentions, conspiracies, and the weight of ancient feuds. How can the Imperium stand resolute when its guardians, its angels of death, fall to open rebellion? Today, we will delve into the roots of this conflict, the rise of Lugft-Huron, the self-proclaimed tyrant of Badab, and the events that set brother against brother in one of the most devastating wars of recent memory. As we uncover the truths buried in the records, be warned. The complete account of the Badab War is not for the faint-hearted. It studies ambition, cruelty, and the perils of unchecked power. But it is also a tale of valor and sacrifice. In understanding the complexities of this war, we gain insight into the balance of power that holds our imperium together and the terrifying consequences when that balance is broken. So please sit and listen closely. The escalating assaults from the malevolent forces emanating from the Maelstrom during the later epochs of the 40th and the nascent centuries of the 41st millennium present a deeply troubling chapter in our chronicles. This vast and ancient stellar anomaly, existing within and beyond the material realm as a warp vortex, has long been a source of consternation and catastrophe, situated perilously near the galactic core. From this churning abyss, myriad horrors have sallied forth, unleashing unspeakable havoc upon the imperial domains. The repercussions of these relentless attacks have been profound and far-reaching, scarring the fabric of hundreds of worlds and systems nearby. Not only have these incursions exacted a grim toll on lives, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, but they have also severely disrupted the vital arteries of imperial logistics. The shipping lanes, dense with transports ferrying essential resources from the star clusters surrounding the Maelstrom, became hunting grounds for these dark forces, further exacerbating the strategic vulnerability of the Imperium. As the onslaughts intensified, the corrosive effects became unmistakably manifest. Notably, the border worlds of the Hybraxis Nebula fell prey to an orc war in the late 700s of M40, a stark testament to the growing boldness and reach of these incursions. Similarly, the vital mining colonies of Lhasa and Cairo, critical for their rich deposits and strategic location, were overwhelmed by mutant hordes bearing the corrupt insignia of chaos during the early years of M41. Such losses marked not mere territorial setbacks, but represented significant erosions of the Imperium's capacity to sustain its military endeavors and industrial output. These attacks' increasing frequency and ferocity heralded a perilous weakening of imperial authority over the Maelstrom Zone, a frontier region whose economic significance belied its apparent remoteness. The slipping grip on this crucial threshold threatened the stability of nearby, more settled sectors and risked a domino effect that could unravel the tenuous borders of the Imperium itself. As control waned, chaos loomed larger, menacing even the relatively secure worlds with the shadow of imminent assault. This dark epoch, fraught with peril and loss, underscores the persistent vulnerability of the Imperium to both the arcane forces swirling within the Maelstrom and the ever-present menace of internal decay and external invasion. The struggle to maintain dominion over such a contested expanse highlights the ceaseless vigilance required to safeguard humanity amidst a galaxy teeming with threats, both seen and unseen. The historical record of this time serves as a grim reminder of the eternal war for survival that defines our existence in this dark cosmos. The area known formally by the ponderous title Maelstrom Adjacent Autonomous Imperial Resource Extraction Zone Grid 004357, more commonly referred to as the Maelstrom Zone, occupies a vast expanse of wilderness space. Positioned galactic west-southwest south of the Maelstrom itself by standard celestial cartography, this immense void in space dwarfs many imperial sectors in its scope, encompassing over 1,000 known star systems. Despite its grand designation, this zone has never been more than a cartographical and administrative division, but rather a coherent realm under the aegis of the Imperium. While containing several major imperial worlds and colonies, this area has eluded central or even nominal imperial control. The vastness and perilous nature of this frontier, barely touched by exploration, renders it effectively beyond the borders of the Imperium proper. a status it has held since the era of the Great Crusade. Nestled between the densely populated stellar masses of the trailing galactic arm and the maelstrom, much of the zone comprises dark voids, starless gulfs interspersed with clusters of celestial bodies scattered unevenly and sparsely. The region is beleaguered by hazardous and unpredictable phenomena such as ionic reefs, null zones, and wandering singularities. Moreover, the erratic influence of the maelstrom, which unpredictably strengthens and weakens, poses a significant threat to navigational attempts through the warp, hampering consistent travel and communication. More than anything, this instability has cemented the maelstrom zone's status as a largely untamed and unmastered domain throughout the millennia. Given these harsh local conditions, it is scarcely surprising that inhabitable worlds are few and far between within the zone. The proportion of star systems possessing viable biospheres is markedly lower than that found in more settled regions of the galaxy. This combination of spatial immensity, environmental hazard, and sparse habitation underscores the formidable challenge of asserting dominion over such a remote and tumultuous region. The few life-sustaining worlds within the Maelstrom Zone have historically held paramount importance, and the contest for their control has invariably been fierce. These worlds offer gateways to the abundant resources of the Zone, resources that are copious and rich. The planets of this region, many of which were initially populated by rogues and exiles, cast out from the galactic core by natural and supernatural upheavals, have proven to be reservoirs of rare minerals, isotopes, and crystalline deposits. These materials, scarce near the galactic center, are found here in more accessible forms. This abundance has consistently attracted humanity to the Maelstrom Zone despite its manifold dangers and formidable challenges. Substantial evidence of human activity stretching back to the dark age of technology in this region underscores the long and perilous allure of its riches. Moreover, these treasures have drawn not only those within the Imperium, but also its numerous and varied foes, each coveting the zone's wealth in their myriad and often vile forms. During the 38th and 39th millennia, as chronicled in our records, several key Imperial outposts within the Maelstrom Zone ascended in importance, emerging as bastions of influence and power amidst the vast uncertainties of the region. These crucial worlds, mere points of light in the dark, formed a vital chain that facilitated the flow of resources from the perilous depths of the Maelstrom Zone to the more settled and secure sectors beyond the galactic arm. Among these, Signax, Sagan, and Badab star systems stood out as crucial nodes of Imperial civilization, each a solitary stronghold amidst the surrounding chaos. These systems became the main arteries through which commerce and materials traveled, supporting the wider Imperial war effort and economic stability. However, this pathway of vital resources and trade became increasingly imperiled as the conditions within the Maelstrom Zone grew more unpredictable. The rising threats not only jeopardized these critical supply lines, but also tested the resilience and strategic acumen of the Imperium's presence in this frontier, marking a period of heightened concern and vigilance. By mid-M41, the heavily militarized hive world of Signax, within the star system sharing its name, stood as the most populous sphere in the northern reaches of the Maelstrom Zone. Signax was a pivotal stronghold, serving as a central bastion of Imperial authority and defense against the region's manifold threats, while also acting as a vital harbor for Imperial fleets. However, in the year 557, disaster struck with the abrupt ferocity of a tempest. The planet was besieged by internal corruption and external assault. The dread Chaos Space Marine warband, the Reborn, spearheaded this devastating incursion. The societal fabric of Signax quickly unraveled into a bloody civil war as tens of thousands of death cult nihilists erupted from the depths of the hive sinks. These zealots embarked on a merciless rampage, slaughtering indiscriminately and demolishing entire city districts, heedless of the broader implications. Despite the valiant efforts of the Mantis Warriors Space Marine chapter, stationed within the nearby Endymion cluster, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The conflict escalated, with casualties mounting into the millions. In a climactic act of devastation, the cultists seized control of parts of the planet's defense missile silo network. Driven by a destructive fervor, they unleashed a barrage of atomic and plasma warheads. This cataclysm obliterated the hive cities and destabilized Signax's orbit, inducing several years of erratic trajectories. The aftermath was a grim tableau of permanent winter, pervasive radioactive fallout, and severe tectonic disturbances. These calamities collectively rendered Signax a dead world, extinguishing all forms of life and sealing its fate as a tragic symbol of the vulnerabilities within the Maelstrom Zone. The catastrophic downfall of Signax sent shockwaves through the northern Maelstrom Zone, reminiscent of a great house collapsing upon the removal of a single, crucial keystone. As Signax fell, Imperial control over the region swiftly disintegrated. Trade routes were severed, and contact with numerous outlying outposts and mining stations was abruptly lost. Signax was transformed into a fallout-shrouded and storm-swept wasteland, its ruins becoming a haunting beacon for scavengers and renegades, both human and Xenos. Isolated from the core of the Imperium, distant worlds found themselves abruptly severed from the central command. Some managed to retrench and struggle for survival on their own, while others faded into ominous silence. Within a single year, a vast swath of space, equivalent to a month-and-a-half's journey under warp, slipped from the Imperium's grasp. This loss, and other setbacks over the preceding centuries, marked a critical tipping point. Vital military supply lines extending across the galaxy, reaching as far as Bacca and even Holy Terra, were now at risk. This dire situation compelled the Adeptus Terra to intervene decisively, reflecting the gravity of the threat not just to regional stability, but to the very sinews of Imperial might. In response to the increasing threats emanating from the Maelstrom, a decisive Edict Imperialis was issued by the High Lords of Terra, mandating the permanent deployment of several Space Marine chapters to the Maelstrom Zone to safeguard Imperial interests and bring order to the region. The Astral Claws chapter, celebrated for its valorous past contributions, was honored to lead the newly established Maelstrom Warders. This strategic coalition also included the fleet-based Lamenters and Charnel Guard chapters, tasked with patrolling the outer reaches of the Maelstrom, along with the Mantis Warriors, already stationed in the nearby Endymion cluster. Upon their arrival, the Astral Claws took command of an orbital battle station in the strategically critical Badab system, establishing it as their fortress monastery and operational base. Stability was swiftly restored to the surrounding areas, with the establishment of the Warder chapters and the support of a permanently assigned Imperial Naval Squadron, which undertook search, destroy, and convoy protection duties. These forces effectively purged the inner zone of heretical and Xenos threats, reclaiming control over a dozen planets and resuming the flow of resources from the Maelstrom Zone to the Imperial coffers. The Scourge campaign was a pinnacle of these operations, spanning from 640 to 651 of M41, where the Astral Claws and their allies launched extensive combat operations deep within the Maelstrom. This bold initiative marked the first time in centuries that an Imperial force had penetrated so deeply into this perilous region. Leveraging intelligence accumulated over 50 years of constant conflict and utilizing ancient charts and secrets from the Mantis Warriors' archives, the Warders' strike forces pinpointed and obliterated numerous enemy strongholds and routed various notorious renegades. During this campaign, in a significant engagement known as the Battle at Tuskar's Wound, the Mantis Warriors exacted their vengeance on the Reborn for the devastation wrought upon Signax. Despite these successes, the campaign was abruptly halted when the Charnel Guard chapter was suddenly withdrawn from the Maelstrom Zone by a direct mandate from the Adeptus Terra. Reassigned to the Thanatos Crusade in the Veiled region, their departure diminished the Warders' strength by a quarter, effectively ending their sustained offensive. The Astral Claws subsequently petitioned for a replacement chapter to restore their depleted ranks. Still, this request was denied, leaving a significant gap in their operational capabilities. Less than 2 decades following the previous trials, the Warders were to endure yet another grave setback. In 681, a space hulk that had not been previously recorded, designated the Unhallowed Heart, emerged at the periphery of the Maelstrom. This monstrous conglomeration of warped cityscapes and derelict ships became a haven for demons, casting those who encountered it into depths of suicidal despair and madness. In a gallant effort to intercept the hulk, several squadron ships and an Astral Claws strike cruiser were lost, all hands perishing as the Unhallowed Heart wreaked havoc on multiple outposts before vanishing through the warp and re-emerging in orbit around the colony world of Ashuna. The devastation on Ashuna was catastrophic. In a harrowing night of violence, a quarter of the planet's population fell to mass suicides, murderous rampages, and unchecked hysteria. The Lamenter's chapter of Space Marines was one of the few able to approach the hulk without immediate fatal consequences. Yet, even they began to feel the insidious effects of its curse as the spectral apparitions of the damned assailed them relentlessly. The Lamenters managed to drive the haunted hulk away from the planet through a series of close-range bombardments and desperate boarding actions. They continued their assault until the dark core of the hulk faded, and it ultimately disintegrated under their sustained attack. The Lamenters suffered severe losses in this endeavor, with over 300 battle brothers and 4 strike vessels sacrificed. An investigation by the Ordo Malleus later criticized the chapter for not destroying the hulk sooner, at the expense of the planet's safety. This assessment was met with indignation by the Lamenters, who expelled the Ordo Malleus delegation, accusing them of insult and ingratitude. This incident marked a low point in the relations between the wider Imperium and the Lamenters, occurring as the Maelstrom Warders were beset by a surge in demonic incursions and corsair attacks, forcing them into a defensive stance as operations near the Maelstrom itself were suspended. Elsewhere in the Maelstrom Zone, the Bakasura, a strike cruiser of the Tiger Claws, reappeared at the fringe of the Segmentum Pacificus. This vessel, belonging to a chapter believed destroyed over 14 centuries prior, seemed to have suffered severe temporal distortions in the warp. For those aboard, mere months had passed. After aiding a Stormwing Space Marine strike force in combat against Eldar slavers, the Tiger Claws were resupplied and set course for their ancestral fortress monastery on Crota. Upon arrival, they discovered their sun had expanded, rendering their world a desolate, irradiated husk, and their chapter reduced to legend. Captain Vitala, now the de facto leader of what was effectively a dead chapter, traveled to Holy Terra to petition for access to the chapter's gene seed stores and rights to rebuild the Tiger Claws. His disappearance while awaiting the hearing led to the dismissal of his petition. Inquisitorial rumors suggested that the chapter, possibly tainted and part of the ill-fated cursed founding, was better left forgotten. The Bakasura, last seen near their ruined homeworld, vanished without a trace, despite attempts to locate it, further complicating the grim narrative surrounding the Tiger Claws. In 718 of M41, a failed palace coup on Badab Primaris ignited an abortive civil war on the Hive world, prompting the Astral Claws to intervene and decisively quell the conflict. Interrogations revealed that the conspirators had ties to raiders and off-world smuggling rings, which had supplied them with arms and tainted drugs to fuel the uprising. As riots and petty revolts began to flare anew across the planet, the matter was brought before Lufthuron for judgment. Outraged by the betrayal and mindful of the lessons from Kignax, Lugv oversaw the re-establishment of order. The astral claws deployed with overwhelming force, executing much of the planet's ruling class and purging the hives of those deemed morally recidivist. Assuming control, Lugv declared himself the tyrant of Badab and claimed the Badab sector as his chapter's fiefdom, invoking the example of Ultramar and the Charter of the Warders to justify his actions. The ensuing years saw the wholesale purging of the ruling elites in nearby systems and the establishment of numerous Astral Claws watch bastions. Huron's chosen allies were installed in key positions of power, transforming the Badab sector into a de facto pocket empire under his command. This consolidation of power was further enhanced by the creation of the Tyrant's Legion, a massive reorganization of the region's disparate and often isolationist native planetary defense forces. These forces were unified under a standard and command structure dictated by Huron. Astral Claws detachments were assigned to enhance their training and purge weak elements. The defense of the Badab sector was the strongest in its history, evidenced by the Tyrant's Legion repelling Corsair raids on Decabalus and Minestra Station. Meanwhile, the Astral Claws, no longer burdened by defensive duties, launched a series of lightning raids into outlying regions to harass and destroy heretic and Xenos-controlled spheres on Bloody Bones and beyond. Lugv fame as the Tyrant of Badab grew, his reputation spreading far beyond the Maelstrom Zone. As his tally of victories increased, pirate activity diminished, and production levels within the Maelstrom Zone reached unprecedented heights. Emboldened by their achievements, Lugv dispatched his envoys on a pilgrimage to Terra, bearing a formal and exhaustive petition. This document meticulously argued the case for the complete subjugation of the Maelstrom and its environs, detailing the substantial benefits such a campaign would confer upon the Imperium. To realize this vision, the petition outlined the necessity for a significantly bolstered deployment of Space Marine chapters to the Maelstrom Warders, positing that a new founding might be warranted to fulfill the plan's requirements. Despite the detailed propositions and potential gains outlined, Huron's petition was summarily dismissed without a full hearing. The decision was based on the grounds that the Imperium's strategic priorities were directed towards more pressing needs elsewhere, leaving Huron's ambitious plans for the Maelstrom unendorsed. Following repeated rejections of his requests to redistribute resources within the Maelstrom Zone, Lugv took a drastic measure by withholding the planetary tithe of Badab Primaris from the Administratum. He also obstructed trade routes passing through his dominion as a protest against the Adepta's failure to allocate adequate resources for policing the Maelstrom. This act had a profound impact, as much of Badab's industrial output depended on the refinement of ores and crystals sourced from the scattered mining outposts across the Pale Stars region of the Maelstrom Zone. Additionally, since the primary viable warp routes in the area traversed through Badab Primaris, this effectively severed the flow of crucial minerals from this vital region. The Tyrant of Badab justified these actions by emphasizing the Astral Claws' role as defenders of the Maelstrom Zone. He redirected the withheld resources and manpower to bolster the defenses of the Badab sector, enhance the Maelstrom fleet detachment, and fortify key worlds under his control. In the Badab system, this led to a significant escalation in space-based defenses, culminating in the creation of a ring of steel around the outer and inner spheres. On Badab Primaris, Huron ordered the ancient citadel of the ruling Dominars demolished, replacing it with the massively fortified Palace of Thorns, built to his own rigorous specifications and design. This political maneuver sparked heated controversy and bitter debate within the Adeptus Terra and the Segmentum Courts Temporal, centered around the tensions between the Administratum's entitlement to the imperial tithe and the ancient rights of Astartes' commanders to defend the Imperium by any means necessary. This conflict, known as the Badab Schism, persisted for over a century. During this tumultuous period, the military operations of the Astral Claws and the Maelstrom Warders continued unabated, set against a backdrop of escalating tensions with the Administratum and Segmentum authorities. The abrupt cessation of the industrial and commercial flow from the Maelstrom zone was felt most acutely in the Carthago sector. For over 11 centuries, the Carthan lords and planetary governors had been granted the charter to manage the Maelstrom zone's industrial output distribution. They controlled its transit from the Administratum-governed supply fortress on Sagan, extending its reach to the western Segmentum Ultima and beyond. Geographically and politically isolated by vast expanses of turbulent and war-torn space from the central authorities at Kar Dunyash, the Carthans had become increasingly complacent and decadent, shielded from the myriad dangers of the galaxy by the struggles and sacrifices of more embattled regions. The only authority they truly feared was the Segmentum Procurators General, who relentlessly demanded their tributes, indifferent to the sudden depletion of the resources that had long sustained their wealth and influence. Despite the controversy and bureaucratic turmoil, their actions had incited hundreds of light-years away. The Astral Claws, now at full combat readiness and unburdened from the demands of garrison duty, turned their attention to a significant conflict within the Imperium. They moved to engage in the aftermath of the notorious Fourth Quadrant Rebellion. This conflict had plagued the Imperium for many decades. Responding to a general call to arms issued to the Astartes in the region, the Astral Claws deployed a formidable force led personally by Lugft Huron to target one of the rebellion's last major strongholds beyond the southern borders of the Maelstrom Zone. At the assembly of the Imperial forces, Lugft Huron was chosen as the battle leader by consensus of a diverse task force that included companies from the Astral Claws, Firehawks, White Scars, and Celestian Guard chapters. Regiments from the Krieg and Kolsek Imperial Guard and the Titans of the Legio Venator further bolstered this coalition. Under Huron's skilled leadership, the task force swiftly and decisively crushed the rebel and chaos presence in the heavily fortified Lycanthos system in less than a year. However, this victory sowed seeds of discontent within the alliance. Stibor Lazirek, the chapter master of the Firehawks, harbored resentment towards Huron for not being chosen to lead the campaign. This resentment would later evolve into a deep grudge against the Astral Claws, setting the stage for further discord and conflict. Returning to the Maelstrom Zone in glorious victory, the Astral Claws quickly built upon their recent successes. In the year 869 of M41, under the directive of Huron, the Black Templars launched a crusade of wrath, striking into the Maelstrom from its eastern borders. Concurrently, the Astral Claws and the Lamenters and Mantis warriors initiated coordinated assaults from the southern and northeastern approaches into the chaotic expanse of the Great Storm. These operations, driven by the tyrant's adept strategic planning and the formidable prowess of the Space Marine chapters involved, led to the cleansing of no fewer than 23 stronghold worlds harboring alien or heretic forces. This included several worlds on the fringes of the Maelstrom that had succumbed to the control of the Word-bearers and their apostate adherents. At the zenith of this campaign, having penetrated deeper into the Maelstrom than any prior Imperial fleet on record, the Astral Claws and Mantis warriors concentrated their formidable forces to obliterate the subhuman denizens of the Howling Gaia. This concerted effort further demonstrated the might of the Imperium and the decisive impact of focused military might against the chaos brooding within the Maelstrom. At the height of the battle against the Flesh Haunters, the first company of the Astral Claws, under the leadership of Lugft Huron, penetrated the depths of the vile creature's carcass vaults. In a decisive maneuver, they unleashed the Life-Eater virus upon these abominations, eradicating a menace that had tormented the Imperium since before the Age of Apostasy. This act secured a significant and widely celebrated victory for the Imperium. However, the triumph was short-lived. External circumstances once again curtailed the ambitions of the Astral Claws when the Black Templars, crucial allies in the campaign, were urgently summoned to assist the beleaguered realm of Ultramar following the Tyrannic War. Having already sustained heavy losses and facing the risk of isolation, coupled with ominous foresight from the Emperor's tarot indicating impending doom, the Warder chapters found themselves compelled to withdraw from the Maelstrom. This retreat, necessary yet frustrating for Huron, prevented the completion of their objectives, adding to his mounting discontent and fury. As the situation deteriorated further, the challenges extended beyond the Maelstrom zone, affecting the broader Imperium. The havoc wrought by Hive Fleet Behemoth had left the defences of the Segmentum Ultima in disarray. From the distant Eye of Terror to the Ghoul Stars, long-dormant threats reawakened, igniting conflicts and rebellions, accompanied by rumours of war and sightings of strange phenomena across the galaxy. In the Maelstrom Zone, turmoil resurged as formidable enemies emerged from the dark recesses. A marauding orc force of a magnitude not witnessed since the Battle of Hell Cyrus rampaged through the Endymion cluster. Simultaneously, the ancient world of Phagos Hex, positioned on the fringe of the Maelstrom Zone, vanished without a trace. The increase in convoy attacks and the occurrence of ghast ships and etheric storms disrupted previously secure warp routes as the Maelstrom grew more intense and expansive. Amidst this chaos, the warp storm's menacing influence sparked cult-led revolts across the scattered mining outposts of the Pale Stars. The threat crept closer to the core as cult activities were unearthed, lurking in the shadows of the Badab sector. This discovery incited a series of relentless pogroms led by the followers of the Tyrant as they sought to purge the insidious threat from their midst. In the waning years of 800 M41, as one crisis cascaded into another, Lugfthuron watched the Maelstrom Zone begin to slip from his control. The Warder's hard-won victories seemed on the verge of unraveling. In response, he sought to consolidate his hold, oblivious to the broader currents shifting against him in the wider Imperium. The stage was set, and the actors positioned for conflict. It would not be long before the smouldering discontent of the Tyrant of Badab ignited into outright violence, precipitating a tragic fratricide within the Imperium itself. Matters escalated quickly as the Carthans and their allies in the Administratum, blinded by their own perceived invulnerability and oblivious to the actual state of the Imperium beyond their secure borders in the Carthago sector, displayed a breathtaking arrogance. Meanwhile, the other warders of the Maelstrom had become increasingly detached and insular, estranged over the centuries from the core tenets of their duty. In their isolation, they unwittingly laid the groundwork for their impending disaster. As preliminary judgments from the Segmentum Courts Temporal began to favour the Administratum in the dispute known as the Badab Schism, the Carthans and their allies within the Administratum saw an opportunity to assert their authority. An Imperial investigation fleet was mobilized under the command of an Administratum Assayer General. This formidable assembly also included representatives from the Adeptus Mechanicus Biologis Invigila, the Lords of the Carthago sector, and at least one independently operating Inquisitor. Their mission was clear: to journey to Badab and demand the immediate surrender of the overdue Badab tithe, the commandeered resources, and the gene seed quotas of the Astral Claws chapter. The fleet, a formidable assembly of several massive mass conveyors anticipating a substantial retrieval of wealth, was led by a trio of powerful cruisers, a cult Mechanicus Locus Caravel, and a cadre of smaller escort craft. This force was a demonstration of the mission's serious intent and a thinly veiled threat directed at the heart of the Tyrant's dominion. In hindsight, the approach can be seen as a grave miscalculation, a show of force perhaps meant to intimidate, but underestimating the potential for conflict. Yet, at that time, few could have predicted the dire consequences that would soon unfold. Under the circumstances shrouded in ambiguity and unresolved, the investigation fleet dispatched to enforce compliance within the Badab system met a catastrophic end. As it attempted to breach the ring of steel that safeguarded the system, the fleet was utterly annihilated, with no vessel surviving the engagement. This devastating incident resulted in the loss of over 20,000 servants of the Imperium. In the chaotic aftermath, accusations flew from all sides. Lufthuron, in delivering his Dominion's official report to the Segmentum authorities, asserted that the fleet had been justly destroyed for its failure to recognize the legitimate authority of the system's rulers, claiming that their aggressive posture had merited such a fatal response under the dictates of imperial law. Conversely, the incident ignited widespread outrage in the Carthago sector, where the ruling elites vociferously condemned the barbarians of the Maelstrom Zone. Trade relations between the two regions deteriorated rapidly, with remaining links severed outright or subjected to intense scrutiny. The governor of the Carthago sector, Tanit Koenig, led a vehement denouncement of the Astral Clause chapter, accompanied by calls for the arrest and trial of Huron on charges of treachery against the Imperium. Simultaneously, local agents of the Magos Invigila sought intervention from their higher echelons for punitive measures against the chapter. Yet, the Adeptus Terra, burdened by its own bureaucratic inertia and preoccupied with more pressing conflicts across the Imperium, hesitated to intervene directly. Given the widespread turmoil and bloodshed elsewhere, this local dispute appeared as a mere entanglement of conflicting claims among regional powers. Moreover, as the recognized and lawful ruler of a realm perennially engaged in warfare, a vital bastion against the threats of alien incursions and chaos, Lufthuron maintained the fundamental right to defend his territories. In the absence of concrete evidence, levying charges of willful and premeditated homicide against Huron for the destruction of imperial servants was deemed nearly unfeasible. Thus, amidst the ongoing turmoil, this grievous incident added another complex layer to the strained relations between the Maelstrom Zone and the broader Imperium. Under mounting pressure from Segmentum authorities and incensed by the obliteration of the Tithe fleet, Carthan Imperial commanders initiated 2 punitive expeditions into the Maelstrom Zone over the following 3 years, purportedly under the banner of Imperial authority. Tragically, both fleets disappeared under mysterious circumstances, reportedly failing even to reach the Badab system, and suspicions of interference by the Astral Clause and their allies loomed large. As these events unfolded, Imperial shipping routes through the Maelstrom Zone, extending even beyond the reaches directly controlled by the Astral Clause in the Badab sector, began to suffer an escalated series of attacks and unexplained disappearances. The Maelstrom Patrol Squadron attributed these incidents to a rise in raider activity and an increase in warp squalls, common hazards in such tumultuous regions. However, with each ship lost, the murmurs of blame directed at Lufthuron and his followers intensified. These accusations resonated not just on the administratum-governed Tithe Fortress world of Sagan at the fringe of the Maelstrom Zone. Still, they echoed throughout the neighboring Carthan sector, where distrust and resentment towards Huron continued to fester and spread. Faced with an inability to decisively influence the unfolding crisis, the increasingly desperate Carthan lords, now on the brink of bankruptcy due to their mounting liabilities, first sought to bypass Badab itself with the support of administratum forces stationed on Sagan. In a collaborative effort, they endeavored to reclaim the lost tithes by navigating the far longer and more perilous routes to the Pale Stars via Kimara. Simultaneously, they escalated quota demands from other worlds within the Maelstrom Zone, such as Vianaya, reaching out to recover resources to offset their deficits. By the year 903, agents of the Carthan Imperial commanders had begun to systematically disseminate propaganda throughout the Segmentum Assizes and the Senatorium Imperialis. Their messages painted Lufthuron, the tyrant of Badab, in damning light, accusing him of moral corruption, treachery, and vainglorious pride. Concurrently, local administratum authorities escalated their appeals to the High Lords of Terror, urging a direct intervention to discipline Huron and his increasingly rebellious chapter. Meanwhile, the Maelstrom Warders were not idle. They continued to arm for war, conducting extensive patrols and military sweeps across the Maelstrom zone, asserting their strength and readiness. Within the Badab sector, a fervent surge in construction activities saw fortifications being massively and rapidly enhanced in anticipation of impending conflict. This flurry of defensive preparations signaled a clear intent. The Astral Claws and their allies were not only ready to defend their domain, but were preparing for the possibility of a broader war. In response to the escalating threats against his dominion, Lugft-Huron crafted his now infamous Articles of Just Secession. These pivotal documents, signed and ratified by Huron and the Masters of the Lamenters and Mantis Warriors chapters, marked a significant moment. Persuaded by Huron's argument about the righteousness of their cause and the unfairness of external demands, these chapters aligned with his vision. The articles were crafted to formally terminate the direct tithing obligations of the Maelstrom Zone to its neighboring sectors, effectively declaring their intent to manage their affairs independently from the traditional structures of the Imperium. Copies of the Articles of Just Secession were dispatched to the Segmentum authorities and the courts temporal, serving as a formal rebuttal to what were described as many and grievous insults, presumptions, and denials of the Emperor-given rights and titles of the Adeptus Astartes by the false and wayward servants of the Administratum, the Carthan Lords, and their allies. These documents articulated the signatories' refusal to submit tithes to local Segmentum authorities, aid or defend any such attempts, or acknowledge the demands imposed by the Carthan Lords. However, they reaffirmed the Maelstrom Warders' commitment to protecting the Imperium as their paramount duty. The articles argued that the Maelstrom Warders should be allowed to protect mankind as they had vowed to the Emperor, free from the corrupt meddling of those who, while claiming to serve the Emperor, purportedly pursued their own aggrandizement and greed. In bolstering their position, the document referenced the original edict that established the Maelstrom Warders and the ancient rights and prerogatives of the Adeptus Astartes, both of which supported their claims strongly. Furthermore, the document called for a comprehensive investigation into the governance of the Carthan sector, affirmed the historic and lawful sovereignty of the involved Space Marine chapters against external interference by the Lesser Adepta, and reiterated their resolve to defend the Maelstrom Zone against any threats. This declaration marked a bold assertion of autonomy and a clear stance against perceived injustices and overreach by sectorial authorities. During this period, Imperial shipping traversing the outer reaches of the Maelstrom Zone began to suffer attacks, with many ships lost to unidentified assailants. Contact with several worlds within the inner zone, still aligned with the Carthans and the Administratum Officio on Sagan, abruptly ceased following garbled distress signals that hinted at assaults and sieges by Space Marine forces. Outraged, the Carthans threatened a full-scale war in retaliation, but lacked the means to launch such a conflict independently. Consequently, they sought assistance from the Departamento Munitorum and the Segmentum Naval Subcommand at Riza, only to be rebuffed. These authorities dismissed the conflicts as internal disputes and declined to intervene. Notably, while the Carthans presented their grievances to these significant imperial powers and the procurators of the Administratum, they deliberately avoided involving the Inquisition, likely fearing the potential repercussions of such an action. On their part, local Inquisition representatives, already preoccupied with other matters, chose to monitor the situation closely without direct involvement. They recognized that such conflicts, however violent, were not uncommon among imperial commanders, especially in frontier regions. Furthermore, no definitive evidence of heresy or corruption had been presented against either party, allowing the Inquisition to maintain a watchful but uninvolved stance on the unfolding events. Faced with rebuffs from higher imperial authorities, the Carthago sector began to prepare for conflict, significantly increasing the recruitment and training within its planetary defense regiments. They also forged a direct military alliance with the Administratum Quaestor of Sagan, who likewise felt the sting of the secession and shared concerns over the tyrant's expanding influence. In a move orchestrated by satrap Tanit Koenig, the Carthans issued direct and open appeals for assistance to several Space Marine chapters with whom they had prior relationships. These appeals sought to aid in reclaiming the lost tithes and ensuring the security of their shipping routes. Under later inquisitional scrutiny, it was revealed that Koenig's rationale was predicated on the belief that only Space Marines could effectively counter other Space Marines in open conflict. It seems her strategy aimed at achieving a temporary disruption or neutralization of the astral claws, using the conflict with a third party as a diversion to restore Carthan's access to the Maelstrom Zone. This strategy, marked by a significant degree of arrogance and miscalculation, was poised to lead to catastrophic results. The Firehawks chapter was the first among the Space Marine chapters to answer the Carthan call to arms, setting the stage for further escalation in the already tense region. At the behest of the Carthan satrap, Koenig, the Firehawks, agreed to investigate the troubling disappearances of Carthan shipping in the region's galactic south of the Golgothan Wastes, which bordered the northern expanses of the Maelstrom Zone. The Firehawks, a fleet-based chapter, had historically used the vast orbital dockyards of the Carthan capital world, Sidon Ultra, for resupply. They had also responded to Carthan's requests in the past to judge wayward planets and neutralize minor Xenos threats within the sector. This history of cooperation formed the basis of the Carthans' confidence in securing the Firehawks' support. The choice of the Firehawks was likely influenced by their past relations and their known volatile and aggressive nature, traits that Satrap Koenig probably considered advantageous for her purposes. At that time, the Firehawks searched and destroyed missions within the Golgothan Wastes. Chapter Master Stibor Lazarek, perhaps motivated by his own agendas, agreed to dispatch several ships to the northern reaches of the Maelstrom Zone. In 904-M41, the Firehawks cruiser Red Harbinger entered the Endymion cluster, an area of ancient stars with long-inhabited human colonies under the stewardship of the Mantis Warriors chapter. Upon entering the Galen system within the cluster, the Red Harbinger was intercepted and surrounded by Mantis Warriors' strike craft. The situation escalated rapidly when the Firehawks cruiser refused to stand down and be boarded. The Mantis Warriors, known for their fierce pride, were provoked by the Firehawks' defiance and opened fire, crippling the intruding cruiser. This violent encounter marked the ignition point of a full-scale conflict between chapters. The subsequent boarding action against the Red Harbinger was fiercely contested. The Firehawks defended their ship with a tenacity reflective of their chapter's martial pride. Heavy casualties were sustained on both sides, and less than 20 Firehawks were taken alive, none of whom surrendered. Their resistance allowed enough time for an astropath aboard to send a message to their chapter, detailing their dire situation and identifying their adversaries. This act set the stage for an even greater regional conflict among the Astartes. Upon receiving news of the capture of the Red Harbinger, Master Stibor Lazarek and the entire Firehawks chapter were consumed by fury. Halting all ongoing operations, the Firehawks fleet was commanded to converge on the Maelstrom Zone with utmost haste via warp travel. The situation quickly intensified, and the arrival of a Firehawks battle group at Galen was met by a combined task force of Mantis Warriors and Astral Claws warships. A fraught standoff ensued, during which the Firehawks secured the release of their captured brethren. Although there was an exchange of threats between the two sides, the Firehawks ultimately decided to withdraw temporarily to regroup with their additional forces, which were scattered across the Golgothan wastes. This regrouping included their formidable flagship, the Raptorus Rex, a pre-imperial mobile star fortress of immense power. The Firehawks, bolstered by the Carthan fleet, commenced a series of probing attacks and reconnaissance missions towards the Badab sector and the Endymion cluster from their rally point at Sagan. However, these initial forays did little more than provoke further hostilities. The tyrant of Badab and his allies had been fortifying their defenses and preparing for conflict for years. Their forces were well seasoned, familiar with the terrain, and strategically prepared for engagement. The Mantis warriors, adept at guerrilla warfare, proved particularly elusive. They maneuvered with uncanny agility within the Endymion cluster's asteroid shoals and nebulae fields, striking unpredictably and then vanishing just as quickly. Moreover, any attempt by the Firehawks to advance towards Badab was thwarted by a formidable and impenetrable array of defenses, leaving the invaders struggling to make any significant headway against the stalwart defenders of the Maelstrom Zone. Leveraging the Carthans to divert attention from the Badab sector and shield them from potential retaliatory strikes, the Firehawks directed their main assault on the feudal agri-world of Iblis, located on the fringe of the Endymion cluster. Their strategy involved attacking civilian targets and igniting vast stretches of crops and veldland, aiming to force the Mantis warriors into open combat. However, the secessionists, who had prepared a counter-strategy, anticipated the Firehawks' movements. While the Firehawks were engaged on Iblis, with the Mantis warriors conducting effective hit-and-run tactics to keep them pinned, the Astral Claws and Lamenters launched a decisive strike on the Sagan system. Sagan, an administratum-controlled system with significant strategic value due to its orbital fleet anchorage and astropathic relay, served as a critical gateway to the Maelstrom Zone. The defenders of Sagan were caught entirely off guard by this sudden and forceful invasion. Despite extensive defensive preparations, the system was overwhelmed within days. The defending planetary forces and Carthan troops were quickly overrun in a brutal conflict. With Sagan now under the control of the tyrant, the strategic landscape shifted dramatically. The secessionists had captured the second most crucial world in the region after Badab. They gained access to its substantial arms, munitions, and supplies reserves. Meanwhile, the Firehawks and Carthan forces, now isolated deep within enemy territory, were severely cut off from logistical support. The situation on Iblis deteriorated for the Firehawks, who were compelled to retreat after suffering severe losses. In a final act of defiance, the Firehawks' flagship, the Raptorus Rex, unleashed a devastating barrage, scorching Iblis as they carved a path out of the attempted blockade. During this fierce withdrawal, the Raptorus Rex encountered and destroyed the Maelstrom Squadron's Mars-class battlecruiser, Sacred Tetrarch, showcasing its overwhelming firepower and the formidable capabilities of the ancient Star Fortress against even the most powerful modern warships. After the tumultuous events that saw the secessionists seize control of Sagan, a brief period of relative calm ensued as they consolidated their gains, and the Carthans retreated in disarray. During this time, the Firehawks, significantly outnumbered, were compelled into a series of running battles and defensive maneuvers on the fringes of the Maelstrom Zone. This phase of forced retreat continued until the Marines' Errant chapter responded to the Firehawks' call for reinforcements. The Marines' Errant diverted a substantial force, 6 companies and a fleet of support vessels, from their preparations for an extragalactic crusade to aid their fellow Astartes. The motivations behind this decision, however, remain somewhat unclear. Unfortunately, the arrival of the Marines' Errant coincided with a renewed offensive by the secessionists. The Starfaring chapter quickly protected Imperial shipping, navigating the perilous routes to the Pale Stars region and the Maelstrom Zone's outlying colonies. Over the next several months, numerous minor skirmishes occurred as the Firehawks gathered their remaining forces in hopes of a decisive battle, while the Marines Errant, understanding the broader strategic picture, dispersed their highly mobile, strike cruiser-based forces to safeguard convoys from increasingly frequent raids and harassment attacks. This strategic divergence placed the Marines errant in a challenging position, caught between the Firehawks' aggressive push to confront and destroy Huron and his allies, and the pressing need to defend Imperial shipping and the Carthago sector's outlying colonies from secessionist attacks. Complicating matters further were the deep-seated bonds of loyalty and camaraderie the Marines errant shared with the Lamentus chapter, their erstwhile allies and recent comrades in arms during the Corinth Crusade, who were now adversaries on the battlefield. This led to several instances where the Marines errant aimed merely to repel the Lamenters during raids, rather than pursue a more aggressive engagement. Such encounters often ended with both sides granting quarter, much to the frustration of their respective allies and intensifying tensions within the Imperial forces. As the year drew to a close, the conflict engulfing the Maelstrom Zone intensified, drawing an increasing number of star systems into a rapidly escalating war. Amid this turmoil, the Firehawks and their Carthan allies endured severe losses. One of the few bastions of resistance, the fiercely isolationist fortress world of Surngrad in the central Maelstrom Zone, held its ground. Its formidable defenses, expertly managed and robust, proved too costly for the secessionists to overcome, without risking significant weakening of their forces. Despite this resilience, the situation elsewhere was grim. A dozen other worlds quickly fell under secessionist control through direct assault or submission, leaving only the periphery and the most inhospitable reaches of the Maelstrom Zone beyond their grasp. The situation for the Carthans and their allies deteriorated further when, in 915, 904 to M41, the Marines errant received news that the Executioners chapter had pledged armed support to the secessionists. This commitment was underscored by the deployment of the warship Night Hag, carrying a fully augmented battle company of Space Marines, fulfilling an ancient blood oath to the Astral Clause. The rest of this notoriously grim and fiercely independent chapter was reportedly mustering on their distant twin homeworlds of Stygia Aquilion, preparing for full-scale war. Driven to desperation and their pleas for assistance to the Procurator Generals of the Adeptus Terra remaining unanswered, Satrap Tanit Koenig was compelled to take drastic measures. With the strategic fleet anchorage at Sagan now under secessionist control, and the Carthago sector's resources nearly depleted by the war's demands, a final effort was launched to secure the resources in the tithe depots of Vayanaya and Kimara before the secessionists could solidify their hold over the western Maelstrom Zone. A hastily assembled armed convoy centered around the vast Chartist highliner Cardinal Urdaneta was convened for this critical mission. Known as Convoy Urdaneta, it included about 20 other armed freighters and mass conveyors. It was protected by the Gothic-class cruiser Dreadchild of Battlefleet Carthago, the Marines' errant strike group Mercurio, and 16 smaller escorts of various classes. This assembly represented a desperate last stand of Carthan force projection into the Maelstrom Zone, a final attempt to reclaim vital resources amidst the chaos of war. The secessionists' intelligence network had already fully penetrated the supposed secrecy of the Carthan mission, allowing them to prepare meticulously for their counterstrike. They bided their time until after the convoy had amassed the resources at Vayanaya, when they were vulnerable mid-transit through the warp. The ambush was executed by a formidable secessionist attack group led by Lugft Huron himself and composed primarily of ships from the Astral Claws and Lamenter's fleets. The convoy, laden with its newly acquired wealth, was systematically encircled and then methodically dismantled, ship by ship, in a series of brutal ship-to-ship boarding actions. These encounters were fiercely contested pitched battles in the murderously confined spaces of warship weapon decks and the vast, airless chambers of mass conveyors. Space Marine assault teams clashed with beleaguered naval crews in intense, close-quarter combat. The outcome was devastating for the Carthans and their allies. The Cardinal Urdaneta, the Dreadchild, and 23 other vessels were captured, with the secessionists managing to secure these prizes while incurring almost no losses to their ships. The Marines' errant strike cruiser, Star Jackal, was the sole capital ship to evade the secessionist net, managing to break free, albeit with significant damage. The overwhelming success of the secessionist forces in seizing convoy Ordinata marked a decisive and crushing victory. This event effectively neutralized the Carthans' capacity to continue active participation in the war, dramatically shifting the balance of power within the Maelstrom zone. With the secessionists clearly ascending, their primary objective shifted to expelling the remaining Space Marine forces, contesting their control of the Maelstrom zone and solidifying their territorial gains. The Astroclaws concentrated their efforts against the Firehawks, driving them back to the fringes of the Golgothan wastes and inflicting severe casualties. Despite the fierce resistance offered by the Firehawks, who exacted a heavy toll in blood for every secessionist victory, the Astral Claws emerged from these engagements without apparent diminution in their combat strength. However, the most significant setback for the forces opposing the secession came when the Mantis warriors orchestrated a decisive confrontation on the industrial moon called Bellerophon's Fall. Known colloquially as the Fall, this moon served as a crucial supply and navigation point and was thus fiercely contested. In the ensuing battle, the Marines errant deployed their renowned tenacity and tactical acumen against the Mantis warriors' adept use of lightning strikes and flanking maneuvers. The conflict climaxed when the Mantis warriors executed a strategic masterstroke, successfully isolating and trapping the 1st and 3rd companies of the Marines errant in the rust zones. This maneuver led to the catastrophic loss of much of the Marines' errant's command structure through a series of precise and devastating strikes. The decimation of their leadership, including the chapter master and the 3rd company captain, left the Marines errant shattered and compelled them to retreat in disarray. In the aftermath of these events, the alliance between the Marines errant and the Firehawks crumbled, marred by bitter recriminations. The secessionist forces capitalized on this disunity, continuing their advances, almost unchallenged throughout the year. Minor skirmishes occurred amid the ruins of Signax and on the outer worlds of the Cerngrad system, further consolidating the secessionist hold. By the end of the year, the Maelstrom zone was firmly under the control of Lufthuron and his allies, marking a decisive shift in the region's power dynamics. As the conflict in the Maelstrom zone escalated, drawing in 5 different chapters of the Space Marines and a 6th en route, alongside various naval detachments and sectarian groups, the situation rapidly intensified into what was becoming the most significant conflict since the infamous 4th Quadrant Rebellion. This escalation compelled the high authorities of the Imperium to intervene decisively. A triumvirate of Imperial legates bearing the seal of the High Lords was dispatched to pass judgment on the conflict. Accompanied by a significant delegation from the Imperial Inquisition of the Ordo Hereticus, an Administratum Auditor Task Force, and a powerful escort battle group from the Segmentum Solar Reserve, the legates were mandated to conduct a thorough inquiry, leaving no stone unturned. The investigation by the Inquisition quickly uncovered a damning array of evidence regarding Lufthuron's actions and those of his Astral Claws chapter. The charges laid against them ranged from discrepancies in the quantities of their returned gene seed to incontrovertible involvement in attacks on Imperial shipping. As for the Carthans, their role was scrutinized with equal severity. To the Inquisition, the Carthans' contribution to the escalation of the conflict bore the hallmarks of not just gross arrogance, but potentially deliberate ambition and misrule. This comprehensive investigation marked a critical turning point as the Imperium sought to restore order and accountability amidst the chaos of the Maelstrom zone. The resolution of the Badab secession crisis was swiftly classified by the Terran legates as a matter of Imperium security, elevating the conflict beyond the scope of a mere civil dispute. This reclassification led to an immediate and unequivocal demand for all parties to cease hostilities and for the secessionists to surrender unconditionally. Luft-Huron, the tyrant of Badab, defiantly rejected these demands, asserting that compliance would expose the worlds and people under his protection to grave dangers, leaving them naked before the enemy. In response to Huron's refusal, the Terran legates issued orders to arrest the chapter masters of all secessionist chapters involved, along with directives to seize their worlds, assets, records, and other chattels. These actions were to be enforced by any necessary means. They were carried out by all loyal forces of the Imperium, wherever and whoever they might be. Thus denounced, the full might of the Imperium was now directed against Luft-Huron and his allies. The conflict had escalated beyond internal squabbles over commerce and influence, or even the fierce rivalries between Space Marine chapters. It had transformed into a stark confrontation between those loyal to the Emperor's rule and the secessionists. This marked the commencement of the Badab War. This conflict would test the limits of loyalty and the resilience of the Imperium itself. Once Space Marine clashed with Space Marine, the conflict within the Maelstrom Zone rapidly intensified. Imperial authorities' attempts to enforce a cessation of hostilities and to effect the arrest and seizure of Luft-Huron only escalated tensions into full-scale war. Despite hopes from some quarters that a catastrophic confrontation could still be averted, such beliefs were swiftly proven naive. Following the Terran legate's decree, a significant deployment of Space Marines was mobilized to enforce the ruling by any means necessary. The Red Scorpions chapter, chosen for their availability and readiness to engage, formed the backbone of what swiftly came to be known as the Loyalist Marine Contingent. They were soon bolstered by additional battle companies from the Salamanders, Raptors, and Fire Angels chapters. Meanwhile, the surviving Firehawks and Marines Errant were ordered to halt independent operations and submit to the High Lord's authority for investigation. The Marines Errant, heavily depleted from recent engagements, complied without resistance. However, the Firehawks, led by Lazarek and determined to enact one final act of retribution before submitting to Imperial command, orchestrated the notorious firebombing of Sacristan. This operation, widely criticized as strategically wasteful and born out of vainglory, was conducted by the chapter's remaining fleet, spearheaded by the star fortress Raptorus Rex. Sacristan, a frontier planet of little strategic importance other than being protected by the Mantis warriors, was targeted. After breaching the planet's modest space defenses and eliminating its leadership and military assets through brutal raids, the Raptorus Rex commenced a relentless plasma bombing campaign from low orbit. Over several harrowing days and nights, the surface of Sacristan was devastated, leaving the planet in flames and resulting in the deaths of over 90% of its population. The Firehawks then withdrew from the ravaged system. Elsewhere, the Loyalist forces had consolidated their strength on Josiah Quintus, situated on the periphery of the Carthago sector, where they organized and prepared for a protracted campaign. While Legate Inquisitor Jarndyce, Frayne of the Ordo Hereticus, held theoretical command over the Loyalists, tactical leadership of the unified Space Marine contingent was bestowed upon Verant Ortiz, Lord High Commander of the Red Scorpions. Ortiz was appointed as Magister Militum, a position that effectively made him first among equals among the commanders of the other Space Marine contingents. This arrangement, a customary practice involving multiple chapters within a single force, reflected the complex dynamics of joint chapter operations. Given the challenges inherent in managing conflicts between Space Marine chapters and their relative autonomy from direct Imperial oversight, Frayne had limited options but to accept this decision. However, he would likely have preferred a commander from a chapter known for being more compliant, as the Red Scorpions are noted for their fiercely independent nature and occasional internal discord. With Ortiz at the helm, the amassed Loyalist forces, bolstered by additional detachments from the Segmentum Solar Fleet Reserve, embarked on their dual objectives. The first goal was to enforce the secessionist chapter's surrender and compliance to the legate's authority. The second objective was to restore and secure the commercial connections between the worlds of the Maelstrom Zone and the broader Imperium, which desperately needed the resources from this region to support its numerous other military engagements across the galaxy. Lord Commander Ortis's initial directive was to deploy his Red Scorpions alongside the main contingent of Battlefleet solar ships to execute a series of tactical maneuvers and feints across regions under secessionist control. This was to assess their resistance and strategic deployments firsthand. This strategy culminated in the heaviest naval engagement of the war to date, the indecisive Battle of Silent Reach, which took place in the year 906 of M41. During this battle, cruiser squadrons from the Maelstrom and Lamenter's fleets clashed with those of Segmentum Solar and the Red Scorpions in the void space between the star systems of Galen and Grief. The encounter ended inconclusively, with both sides sustaining damage without significant losses to their major ships. Analysts later suggested that neither faction was fully prepared to commit their main battle lines, fearing substantial losses. The most critical damage occurred when the Maelstrom fleet's flagship for this engagement, the Overlord-class battlecruiser Gauntlet of Wrath, suffered a catastrophic hit, a fortunate lance strike from the light cruiser. Lady Sibylline penetrated its void shields, causing severe damage to its main bridge. This left the Gauntlet of Wrath uncontrollable, drifting away from its escort. Seizing the opportunity, several Red Scorpions strike cruisers quickly engaged, and despite the desperate defensive efforts from the Gauntlet's gun crews, they managed to overwhelm the venerable warship in a fierce crossfire. Raiding parties then boarded and finished off the crippled ship, leaving it a gutted, flaming hulk before secessionist reinforcements could intervene. The secessionist fleet disengaged and retreated into warp, allowing the Loyalists to claim a tentative victory. This battle was the largest among a series of around a dozen rapid engagements during this period, featuring both void combats between starships and intense surface battles on frontier worlds. Despite these efforts, the substantial Loyalist forces successfully checked and contained the secessionist advance. This was particularly true after the Marines Errant and Firehawks, having been cleared of any heretical or seditious intent, contributed their remaining forces to the Loyalist effort. However, unexpectedly robust resistance prevented any significant territorial gains. Faced with a tenacious enemy, Lord Commander Ortiz had initially hoped that a broad front strategy would expose vulnerabilities in what he assumed to be an overextended enemy line, but no apparent weaknesses materialized. Consequently, Loyalist strategies began to evolve in response to the enduring resilience of the secessionist forces. With the secessionist advance now effectively contained, Lord Commander Ortiz devised a strategy to exert significant pressure on a critical weak point: the Viania system. Viania, a vital world, served as a strategic gateway on one of the secondary warp routes skirting the Maelstrom's rim. Auspex analysis and intelligence sources suggested that its defenses and garrison were less formidable than the heavily fortified Sagan system. Additionally, intelligence reports indicated ongoing unrest against the secessionists on Viania, which could potentially be ignited into open revolt by a Loyalist incursion. While the Firehawks and the newly arrived Raptors contingent maintained patrol and escort operations, strike forces composed of the Red Scorpions, Marines Errant, and Nova Marines launched a three-pronged attack on the Viania system. This operation was the first in a series of heavy raids executed rapidly. The primary goal of these raids was to cripple Viania's production capabilities and orbital transshipping platforms, with a secondary objective of loosening the secessionists' control over the system. In the ensuing battles, Loyalist Space Marines engaged the reorganized Badab sector planetary defense forces of the Tyrant's Legion in open warfare for the first time. the resilience of these forces was significantly underestimated. As a result, the Loyalist strike group struggled to achieve their objectives during the initial raid, managing to disable only one of the 4 orbital platforms. Additionally, while some damage was inflicted on Vayanaya's manufacturing complexes, overall production continued with minimal disruption. Intercepted communications from the Vayanaya Command Vox network revealed the high cost of resistance for the Tyrant's Legion, with the Loyalists inflicting an estimated kill ratio of greater than 178-1 against the human auxilia defending the system. The final raid on Vayanaya proved devastating for the Tyrant's Legion. Red Scorpion forces launched direct assaults into the Kalian industrial hive, aiming specifically to inflict mass casualties among the human defenders and to target any Astral Claws Space Marine leaders present within their ranks. This aggressive tactic marked a significant escalation in the Loyalists' efforts to break the secessionist hold on the system. Despite the repeated Loyalist raids, the secessionists maintained their hold over Vayanaya. Shortly after that, further grim news reached the Loyalist command. First, it was reported that several military convoys along their rear supply lines from the Carthago sector had been attacked and scattered by an unknown warship, later identified as the Night Hag of the Executioner's chapter. Secondly, reports came in regarding Sørngrad's beleaguered state. The fortress world of Sørngrad, situated deep within the Maelstrom zone, had thus far remained independent, its warlords defiantly refusing to submit to the tyrant of Badab. The planet's formidable defenses had held out against repeated assaults by the secessionist fleet. However, Sørngrad had partially fallen due to internal treachery, with Huron's forces now occupying its northern citadels. At the same time, the southern bastions struggled to hold on. The Loyalists, faced with the reality that Sørngrad was too deep in secessionist-controlled territory to mount an effective relief operation, were forced to reckon with the dire prospect of the ancient fortress world falling entirely into enemy hands. Such a scenario posed a significant strategic threat, turning Sørngrad into a nearly impregnable base for the secessionists and complicating any future Loyalist operations in the Maelstrom zone. With the war at an impasse, the secessionists unexpectedly broke the deadlock with a surprising proposal. Huron, in a bold move, sent emissaries to the Loyalists, offering a temporary ceasefire and an honourable parley with Verant Ortiz, the Loyalist commander, to halt further bloodshed between what he called loyal brothers. Despite strong objections from Legate Inquisitor Frayne, Ortiz agreed to the meeting, trusting Huron's word as a fellow chapter master to honour the truce. However, Ortiz clarified that he would remain resolute in executing the High Lord's judgment. Arrangements were made for a face-to-face meeting between Huron and Ortiz on an abandoned way station in orbit around the gas giant Shedim, located in the far reaches of the uninhabited Grief system. The station, a long-forgotten naval supply depot built into an asteroid, had been deserted for centuries due to solar flare activity. Though it maintained a thin atmosphere, it was otherwise a dead place. As planned, each party approached the station aboard a single unescorted strike cruiser. Both leaders and their honor guards were ferried to the station by Thunderhawk gunships, and their cruisers withdrew to positions outside of weapon range. The meeting occurred in a vast, derelict cargo vault at the heart of the station. From the fragments of damaged records later recovered, it is clear that tensions immediately flared. Lugt Huron acted as though it was Ortiz and the Loyalists, not the secessionists, who had broken imperial law. His delegation included Chapter Master Sartak of the Mantis Warriors, who swiftly accused the Firehawks of committing genocide against civilians loyal to the Imperium, demanding that Lazarek face trial by combat. Huron himself, imperious and volatile, launched into a tirade against his enemies, accusing them of betrayal and daring to suggest that Ortiz should submit to him and fight under his banner against those who, in Huron's words, sought to make the Astartes no more than lickspittle slaves to their own petty greed. Ortiz, steadfast, reaffirmed the authority of the legatine writ and the High Lord's unassailable right of summons. As the talks grew increasingly heated, an adjournment was called. Both parties withdrew to separate chambers on the station to confer. It is at this point that the events become murky. Loyalist communications to their strike cruiser were suddenly cut off, and what happened next remains a subject of debate and speculation. Conflicting reports and damaged records have left what transpired shrouded in mystery. What is certain is that 3 unidentified vessels, 2 likely iconoclast pattern raiders, a renegade design, and a 3rd light cruiser of unknown origin, attacked from concealed positions deep within the gas giant Shadim's thick atmosphere. These attackers struck before the Loyalist or secessionist ships could respond, unleashing a barrage of firepower on the asteroid base. Following the bombardment, a raiding party composed of heretics, mutants, and other renegades boarded the way station. In the chaos that followed, Lord Commander Verant Ortiz, the revered chapter master of the Red Scorpions, was killed, along with several members of Huron's party, including Chapter Master Sartak of the Mantis Warriors. The precise circumstances of their deaths remain shrouded in mystery. As the situation spiraled out of control, a 3-way battle erupted in space around the way station. The Red Scorpions' chief librarian, Severin Loth, led a desperate counter-assault, deploying via assault ram and teleportation to retake the station. At the height of the battle, the unknown light cruiser, heavily damaged by fire from the Astral Claw's strike cruiser, collided with the way station and exploded, setting off a chain reaction that tore the asteroid apart. Amid the chaos, Severin Loth managed to recover the remains of his fallen chapter master, clashing with both the raiders and Huron's Astral Claws as the station disintegrated. Ultimately, both sides were forced to flee to avoid certain destruction. Despite the devastation, Severin Loth's retrieval of Ortis's body restored the honor of the Red Scorpions, creating an enduring legend for himself amidst the tragic loss. As for Luft Huron, he appears to have escaped early in the battle, though his involvement in the deaths of Lord Commander Ortiz or Chapter Master Sartak remains unproven. What exactly transpired in those final moments remains an unresolved mystery. After what quickly became known among the Loyalists as the betrayal at Grief, accusations and counter-accusations flew between the warring factions, and many within the Loyalist ranks denounced Luft Huron, viewing the attack as a calculated treachery orchestrated by the tyrant. The secessionists, in turn, blamed the Inquisition, alleging a covert plot to assassinate Huron. Legate Inquisitor Freyne's communique to his fellow Ordo Hereticus agents were more nuanced, suggesting the possibility of third-party intervention, malefic forces with much to gain from stoking the flames of war and plunging the Maelstrom zone into further bloodshed and anarchy. Freyne did not rule out the notion of Huron's involvement, but his theory hinted at a far more complex motive. He speculated that the primary target of the attack might not have been Lord Commander Verant Ortiz, but rather Chapter Master Sartak of the Mantis Warriors, with Ortiz's death merely serving as a convenient smokescreen. This theory, however strange it might seem, carries a certain weight. Evidence from the period reveals growing unrest within the Mantis Warriors regarding their continued support for the secession. Though deeply committed to defending the independence of the Maelstrom Warders and resisting external aggression, they still viewed the High Lord's direct judgment with some reverence. Furthermore, rumors about the increasingly tyrannical rule of the Astral Claws in their own domains had been causing unease within the Mantis Warriors for some time. Suppose Sartak's death could be blamed on the Loyalists. In that case, it might harden the Mantis Warriors' resolve, silencing internal dissent. Even better, if the Red Scorpions could believe that the Mantis Warriors were responsible for Ortis's death, it would drive a deeper wedge between the two factions, leaving the secessionists unified under Huron's leadership. With the prospect of reconciliation between the factions now shattered, the war escalated to even greater ferocity. Neither the Red Scorpions nor the Astral Claws intended to offer quarter. Soon, darker truths would come to light, secrets that cast the secession in an even more ominous and insidious shadow. Given the turbulent tides of war that had engulfed the Maelstrom Zone, it was perhaps inevitable that attacks from unaffiliated raiding forces and Xenos factions, long lurking within the storm's shadowy depths, would escalate. Such assaults had reached their zenith. Imperial intelligence, prone at the time to blaming every such threat on the machinations of the tyrant of Badab, fell into the habit of attributing every pirate raid or Xenos incursion to his influence. Evidence gathered over the years, however, tells a different story. The grim reality was that, with the Maelstrom's festering malevolence at their backs and the Loyalists pressing in from the front, the secessionists found themselves suffering disproportionately at the hands of these unaffiliated predators. During this period, warbands from the Orc Gorchompa pirate clan surged out of the green skin-infested Kala system, eager for battle and driven by plunder. The Orcs' terror ships wreaked havoc on secessionist supply convoys, running between the Endymion cluster and the Badab sector, ultimately drawing the Mantis warriors into battle on Endymion itself. With their crude but formidable landers, the Orcs put down a warband estimated to be 20,000 strong, complete with battle wagons, buggies and various makeshift khans. They quickly overwhelmed Endymion's meager garrison, forcing the Mantis warriors to launch a counter-invasion to prevent the world from falling entirely. The battle on Endymion's dust plains became a rapidly shifting, chaotic engagement. The Mantis warriors utilized their Predator and Razorback squadrons, supported by relentless Thunderhawk gunship strikes, to bait the Orcs into feigned retreats. The enraged greenskins fell for the ploy time and again, leaving a trail of burning wrecks and dead scattered across 50 kilometers of the Orella Plains. Though costly, the Mantis warriors eventually broke the Orc advance, stemming the tide of destruction. Yet as destructive as the Orc incursion was, it paled compared to a more sinister threat that had begun to grow, a threat whose implications were far more dire. This was the rise of demon-tainted corsair cults on the blighted world of Magog. The resurgence of these cults, thriving amidst the planet's corruption, had not only forced the recent Orc incursions, but also represented an existential threat to the secessionists. The cult's growing power became a pressing concern that Huron could not afford to ignore. Soon, the secessionists had no choice but to act preemptively. Under the command of Corian Sumatris, one of Huron's most trusted battle leaders, an Astral Claws battle barge was diverted from the front lines for a direct assault on Magog. Sumatris led 2 companies of Astral Claws, along with a contingent of hand-picked Astral Claws and Lamenter's Terminators, in a daring raid meant to decapitate the nascent threat. The cost was considerable. The secessionist force sustained grievous casualties, their mission proving to be a costly distraction at a critical juncture in the broader war. Yet Huron understood the stakes well enough. Ignoring Magog's festering corruption risked the birth of a new horror that would have forced them to fight a war on 2 fronts. By taking the fight to Magog, they managed to stifle this rising threat before it could reach its full potential. But the cost was precise. Resources and forces that might have reinforced their lines against the Loyalists had been diverted, leaving a vulnerability that would soon be exploited as a fresh enemy took the stage. Thus, the secessionists found themselves pulled in conflicting directions, juggling threats from without and within. Every victory seemed to come at a price, and every step forward was dogged by unseen dangers waiting in the shadows, their menace amplified by the ever-present Maelstrom, a crucible that spared no one in its relentless grasp. The arrival of the Minotaurs, a powerful fleet-based chapter with a sinister reputation and uncertain loyalties, marked a significant shift in the unfolding conflict within the Maelstrom Zone. They came in full strength in the mid-year of 907, announcing their participation with a brutal opening strike. Hitting the secessionist-controlled mining facilities on Cairo, the Minotaurs launched a full chapter-scale assault, slaughtering the 46,000-strong Tyrant's Legion garrison and rendering the mines utterly unusable. After this display of raw power, the Minotaurs dispatched a ship to formally present themselves to the Loyalist War Council. However, their enigmatic chapter master, Asterion Moloch, stayed behind with his forces. The Minotaurs' approach to war was anything but subtle. Moloch led his chapter across the Pale Stars region, conducting a campaign aimed at obliterating rather than conquering essential resources and production facilities. It was a deliberate effort to weaken the secessionists by starving their war effort, striking a calculated and ruthless series of pre-planned targets. Their arrival, though cautiously welcomed by the Loyalists, added substantial firepower and expertise, particularly in heavy assaults. The Minotaurs were well equipped with strike cruisers, land raiders, and vindicators, and they proved merciless in executing their role as a besieging force. Their attacks were indiscriminate and ferocious. They struck the secessionist-held systems, independent minor outposts, and even those that had maintained nominal allegiance to the distant Carthan authorities. They coordinated their efforts with Loyalist command, but operated with a wide degree of autonomy in the southern Maelstrom zone, especially across the Pale Stars and the Dean-Stellar Drift regions. In these engagements, their ruthless efficiency left no survivors among those who dared resist them, furthering the grim reputation that preceded them. The scale of devastation they wrought went unchallenged until the later arrival of the Carsharadons to the Loyalist cause. Until then, the only effective opposition to the Minotaurs' onslaught came from the warships and strike forces of the executioners. The battles between these two chapters took the air of a brutal sport, with each side seemingly eager to test its prowess against the other in an escalating series of clashes. The Minotaurs achieved numerous key victories through the remainder of 907. They all but annihilated the Tyrant's Legion forces on Crow's World and Larsa, conducting savage planet strikes that left nothing but ashes in their wake. Their relentless assaults forced the Astral Claws and their puppet worlds to abandon their fortified positions, lest they risk being isolated and destroyed one by one. The sheer destruction they caused was immense, and the collateral damage was staggering. Within a mere third of a standard year of their arrival, it is estimated that the human population across the Pale Stars had been reduced by over 20%. The Minotaurs' impact was both tactical and psychological. Their presence brought undeniable strength to the Loyalist effort, but their methods also exacted a heavy price on the very people they were nominally protecting. To the Minotaurs, the end seemed to justify any means, and they carved a path of terror and ruin through the southern Maelstrom zone, one that would not be easily forgotten. Theirs was a force that thrived on attrition, and the name of Asterion Moloch became one whispered in fear among allies and enemies alike, a harbinger of devastation and merciless warfare that brought yet another layer of grimness to an already bloody conflict. The Minotaurs chapter, while nominally ceding overall strategic authority to the Loyalist War Council, maintained a deliberate distance from the broader chain of command. They operated autonomously, often deferring to Legate Inquisitor Freyan rather than High Commander Cullen or his advisors. This distance was underscored by their choice of representative, a gaunt and taciturn figure, Chaplain Enkomi, whose red-rimmed eyes observed the council proceedings while offering little input. No record of Asterion Moloch, the chapter master, ever attending these councils in person. Instead, his presence was known only through battlefield-picked footage and whispered tales from the few survivors of the Minotaurs' unrelenting attacks. Moloch remained an enigmatic and feared figure, a looming spectre whose absence seemed as deliberate as his actions on the field were ruthless. Despite this detachment, the Minotaur's power and prowess quickly became a pivotal force in the Loyalist effort. Their methodical and often merciless tactics began to tip the balance. The chapter's brutal efficiency had yielded significant results. Through well-executed set-piece battles and savage boarding actions, the secessionist forces were steadily pushed back from critical systems, incurring heavy losses. The Minotaurs, with their relentless assaults, proved to be an unstoppable tide that the secessionists struggled to resist. The conflict took on a different character elsewhere in the northern central Maelstrom zone. The battle for Galen, initially a straightforward confrontation between the Astral Claws and a combined Loyalist force of Salamanders and Fire Angels, turned into a chaotic three-way struggle as a popular uprising erupted. The battered population of Galen, driven to desperation, seized the moment and fought for their independence amidst the chaos. Despite the unpredictability of this insurgency, the Loyalists ultimately gained control of the system. However, the cost was significant, and the ground they held was haunted by the embers of rebellion and the echoes of a world torn apart by competing allegiances. Thus, the end of the 901st year there marked a turning point, one born not just of military might, but of a growing realization among the scattered and weary inhabitants of the Maelstrom that the tide had begun to turn against the secessionists. The Minotaur's arrival and ferocious campaign brought victory and terror with it, an indifferent hammer blow to the Maelstrom's tumultuous heart, unflinching and decisive. Their methods left few survivors, but their impact was undeniable, reshaping the course of the conflict and heralding a grim hope for the Loyalist cause. In yet another grievous blow to the secessionist cause, Vianaya, battered by repeated Loyalist attacks over recent years, finally fell. This culminated in a massive, coordinated assault by the Minotaurs and Red Scorpion chapters. Vianaya had long since been bled dry, its resources stripped to fortify defenses elsewhere, leaving it vulnerable. Lugft Huron, ever pragmatic, had effectively abandoned the world, leaving its considerable Tyrant's Legion garrison to its fate. The end, when it came, was swift and brutal. Charcoal grey and bronze drop pods rained from the night sky, descending upon the proto-hive of Kalian, striking the streets and industrial plazas with relentless precision. Fire tore through the darkness as the Loyalist strike force landed in an overwhelming night assault. The garrison was caught unprepared and overwhelmed by the sudden fury of the attack, and it was thrown into utter disarray. Panic spread through the ranks of the Tyrant's Legion as the Lehman Russ squadrons and auxiliar infantry, confused and disoriented, fired blindly, some even turning their weapons upon their own in the chaos. Amid the carnage, the Minotaurs and Red Scorpions advanced with cold precision, their purpose unwavering. They were angels of death in the darkness, falling among the secessionist defenders, carving their way through the city in a chaotic and blood-soaked melee. The streets became a tangled slaughterhouse, and the industrial plazas were a burning testament to the Loyalist assault. By dawn, Vianaya was firmly in Loyalist hands, and what remained of the Tyrant's Legion garrison was mercilessly put to the sword. The fate of Vianaya was sealed not with negotiations or terms of surrender, but with the utter annihilation of its defenders, a grim reminder of the unyielding nature of this conflict, where mercy had long since been left behind. Uncovered alarming evidence of ongoing collusion between the Astral Claws, renegade human factions, and heretic scavengers from the Golgothan wastes. The details revealed a plot to recover ancient weapons caches buried in the dead world of Synax. Once a thriving hive world, now a desolate and radiation-poisoned husk. In response, the Loyalists sanctioned a scourging operation to prevent these weapons from falling into secessionist hands, and the Sons of Medusa's Atropos clan company was tasked with leading this mission, supported by a newly arrived company of the Exorcists chapter. The Loyalist force established a blockade around Signax, before conducting a systematic grid sweep of the world. The numerically inferior secessionist forces, along with their renegade allies, withdrew into the shattered ruins of the hive cities, seeking refuge in the radiation-soaked wastelands and twisted urban remnants. The scourging of Signax became a grueling and protracted campaign, with loyalist forces laboring to dislodge the tyrant's allies from their bolt holes, amid a landscape twisted by death and decay. However, tensions simmered between the two loyalist chapters. The exorcists accused the Sons of Medusa of harboring ulterior motives, more concerned with their own arcane interests in Signax's secrets than with the swift eradication of the enemy. The distrust eventually culminated in the exorcists' withdrawal, and their force was redeployed to join the impending assault on the Sagan system. The Sons of Medusa remained behind, left to pursue the Signax operation in their own manner, unburdened by outside oversight, a task that suited them and their methods well. With that, we conclude Part 1 of our exploration of the Badab War. We have traced the unfolding of the conflict from its earliest skirmishes to the boiling point that saw the entry of new chapters and escalating brutality on both sides. This conflict was defined by the clash of arms and the conflicting wills of those who sought to control a fragmented and unsteady frontier of the Imperium. We have seen noble intentions twisted by ambition, oaths shattered by necessity, and shadows lengthening across the loyalist and secessionist lines. By 908 of M41, the struggle for the Maelstrom Zone had already become one of attrition, desperation, and shifting alliances, with the worst yet to come. In Part 2, we'll delve deeper into the darker chapters of the war, the betrayals, the madness, and the final reckoning of the tyrant of Badab. Thank you for listening. May the Emperor protect you.